Have you ever imagined having everything money can buy? Imposing mansions rising in exclusive neighborhoods, with perfectly manicured gardens and iron gates that open in absolute silence. Luxury cars lined up in the garage, each more expensive than the last, ready to take their owner anywhere in the world within minutes. International trips on private jets, five-star hotels, experiences reserved only for a select group of people who never need to look at the price of anything. For many, this would be the peak of happiness, the final destination of all dreams. But what if, in the midst of so much wealth, something essential was still missing? Something invisible, silent, that no amount of money can buy? Richard had spent his entire life chasing success. From a young age, he showed sharp intelligence for business and an uncommon determination. While others were content with a comfortable life, he wanted more. He wanted to reach the top. He wanted to win. He wanted to prove to the world and to himself that he was capable of conquering everything he desired. He worked tirelessly, opened companies, closed million-dollar deals, faced financial crises, and emerged from them even stronger. Over time, his name became associated with power, influence, and absolute success. The media admired him. Magazines featured his face on their covers with titles like "The Man Who Turned Ideas into Fortunes" or "The Millionaire Who Never Fails." People envied him in silence, dreaming of having just a fraction of what he possessed. At social events, Richard was always the center of attention. Everyone wanted to be near him, to hear him speak, to learn his secrets. In everyone's eyes, he had won the game of life. But there was one detail no one saw. Behind the tailored suits and the confident smile, Richard carried a silent emptiness. A space inside him that, no matter how many zeros were in his bank account, was never filled. At night, when he arrived at his large, immaculate mansion, the silence was almost deafening. The hallways echoed with lonely footsteps. There was no laughter, no spontaneous conversations, no one waiting for him. Only cold walls and automatic lights that turned on and off as he passed. The nights were the worst. Richard would sit in his gigantic living room, with a breathtaking view of the illuminated city, holding a glass of expensive wine that he rarely finished. He watched television without really paying attention. He scrolled through his phone, answered business messages, closed yet another deal. Even so, he felt that something was deeply wrong. It was as if his entire life had been built to impress others, but not to satisfy his own soul. He tried to fill the emptiness in many ways. He bought more possessions, took even more exclusive trips, attended luxurious parties, met interesting people. He tried relationships, but nothing seemed to last. Everything felt superficial, temporary, disposable. Deep down, Richard felt that people approached him for what he had, not for who he was. And that left him even more isolated. It was in this state of mind that something unexpected began to change the course of his story. On an apparently ordinary morning, Richard decided to go for a drive with no destination. He didn't want meetings, he didn't want conversations, he didn't want commitments. Just driving. He left the city and followed less busy roads, passing through simple neighborhoods, far from the luxury he was used to. That was when his eyes were drawn to a small, worn sign by the roadside. Animal shelter. Help adopt. Richard slowed down. He had never seriously thought about having an animal. His routine was always too full, his life too organized, his house too silent. Still, something about that sign caught his attention. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the emptiness asking for something different. Without thinking too much, he turned the steering wheel and went in. The shelter was simple. Low buildings, old fences, the smell of dog food mixed with disinfectant. Nothing there resembled Richard's sophisticated world. Employees looked at him with a certain surprise. It wasn't common for someone like him to appear in that place. Still, they greeted him politely. As he walked down the corridors, the sound of barking echoed from all sides. Some dogs jumped against the bars. Others watched in silence with tired eyes. Richard passed several kennels. He saw small dogs, large dogs, young dogs, elderly dogs. Some had signs indicating friendly, good with children, ready for adoption. And then, at the end of the corridor, almost hidden, there was a different space. More isolated, more silent. Inside that kennel was a pit bull. Large, muscular, with visible scars across his body and a look that mixed distrust and sadness. He didn't bark. He didn't approach. He just watched, motionless, as if he had already learned that no one stayed for long. A sign on the gate simply read, "Thor, complicated history. Not recommended." Richard stopped. Something about that animal caught his attention immediately. Maybe it was the contrast between physical strength and the defeated look. Maybe it was the fact that, while all the other dogs begged for attention, Thor seemed resigned to rejection. Richard approached slowly. The pit bull lifted his head, but did not growl. His eyes met Richard's for a brief moment. That was where everything began to change. A staff member quickly approached, with a worried expression. She said that the dog had been returned several times, that no one could handle him, that there was fear, prejudice, poorly told stories. They told Richard that he was dangerous, unpredictable, a huge responsibility. They advised him to look at other animals. Any other. Richard listened to everything in silence. Throughout his life, he had followed advice. Consultants, specialists, analysts. People telling him what was safe, what was profitable, what was worth it. And almost always, that had led him to financial success. But at that moment, something inside him said that, for the first time, maybe it was time to ignore all external voices. While everyone else saw a problem, Richard saw a reflection of himself, of being judged by appearance, rejected by the past, carrying scars that no one wanted to understand. For the first time in a long while, he felt something different from emptiness. He felt connection. And without knowing exactly why, Richard made a decision that would save and change his life forever. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Here you will find real, emotional, and meaningful stories. Stories that show how a single decision can change an entire life. If you believe in second chances, this channel is for you. Who Richard was before the decision. Before his life took a completely unexpected turn, Richard lived in a universe shaped by ostentation, excess, and the constant pursuit of more. His world was made up of rigorously scheduled commitments, endless meetings, and decisions involving sums capable of changing the fate of entire companies. From the moment he woke up until the instant he finally retired at night, his routine was dictated by the clock, the market, and the pressure to always remain at the top. Richard was not just a rich man. He was a symbol of success. His name circulated in boardrooms, international conferences, and exclusive high society events. Wherever he went, he was treated with almost reverential respect. People stood up when he entered a room. His point of view was heard as if it were an unquestionable truth. He had built a solid empire, the result of years of obsessive work, bold decisions, and a discipline that few could keep up with. His day began early, almost always before sunrise. Even surrounded by extreme comfort, he rarely appreciated the small details of life. Breakfast was quick and functional, often eaten while he read financial reports on a state-of-the-art tablet. The driver was already waiting, and the ride to the office was used for strategic calls. Richard spoke with executives, lawyers, investors. His mind was always several steps ahead, anticipating risks, calculating gains, eliminating any possibility of error. Meetings followed one after another without pause. Large rooms, screens displaying complex graphs, growth projections, cold numbers representing profits, losses, and opportunities. For Richard, this was familiar territory. It was the environment where he felt in control. There, emotions had no place. Only logic, strategy, and decision-making power. People were numbers, markets were game boards, and he was an experienced player. However, behind this image of absolute control, something was silently deteriorating. As the years passed, Richard realized that his personal life had been pushed into a forgotten corner. Not for lack of opportunities, but for lack of priority. Human relationships required time, patience, vulnerability, things he had learned to avoid. True friendships were left behind. Contacts became utilitarian. People entered and exited his life according to their momentary usefulness. At night, after long workdays, Richard often frequented expensive restaurants, where reserved tables and impeccable service awaited him. He sat among business people, celebrities, and influential figures. Conversations revolved around investments, market trends, international politics. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, but everything felt rehearsed, artificial. When he returned home, often accompanied, he felt the same emptiness when he closed the door. His mansion was a perfect portrait of his financial success. Modern architecture, minimalist decor, valuable works of art hanging on the walls. Every object had been carefully chosen to convey sophistication and power. Still, the atmosphere was cold, impersonal. There were no old photographs, no sentimental keepsakes, no signs of a story built with someone. Just large, silent spaces where the most constant sound was the echo of his own footsteps. Richard often walked through the corridors at night, with no specific destination. Sometimes he stopped in front of the enormous windows and observed the illuminated city. Thousands of lives unfolding out there, people coming and going, loving, making mistakes, living. And he, despite having everything, felt disconnected from all of it. It was a strange, paradoxical loneliness. He was never truly alone, yet he never felt accompanied. Romantic relationships followed the same pattern. Intense at the beginning, based on admiration, luxury, and empty promises. But they quickly wore out. Richard realized that few people wanted to know who he truly was. Most were enchanted by what he represented. When a mask began to fall, when a need for emotional depth emerged, he pulled away. It was easier to keep everything superficial than to face his own vulnerabilities. Deep down, Richard believed that happiness lay in accumulation. Each new contract signed, each company acquired, each property purchased brought a momentary sense of victory. A brief relief, a peak of satisfaction that lasted only a short time. Soon after, the emptiness returned, bigger and more uncomfortable. So he chased the next conquest again, as if trapped in a cycle that never completed itself. There were moments when he wondered exactly when he had lost touch with himself. At what point ambition stopped being a tool and became a prison. But these reflections were quickly interrupted by new demands, new challenges, new goals. Thinking too much meant feeling too much, and feeling was something he had learned to avoid. Despite everything, Richard did not consider himself unhappy, at least not in the conventional sense. He did not lack anything, did not face visible drama, did not have major external crises. His suffering was silent, internal, almost invisible, an emotional exhaustion that did not appear in reports nor on magazine covers, a weariness of the soul that no one applauded, but that consumed him slowly. Money, he discovered too late, solved many problems. It bought comfort, security, status, but did not buy meaning. It did not buy belonging. It did not buy peace. Richard had conquered the outer world, but lost access to his own inner world. And it was exactly in this state, surrounded by everything, yet empty inside, that he approached a decision no one around him would understand. A choice that seemed small, almost insignificant, but that would shake the foundations of everything he believed about success, value, and happiness. Before that encounter at the shelter, Richard did not yet know it. But his life, built on numbers and appearances, was about to be confronted by something far simpler, far more genuine, and infinitely more transformative. The animal no one recommended. It was during an almost casual visit to an animal shelter that Richard met Thor. Nothing about that day had been planned. It was not part of his schedule. It was not on his list of priorities, nor did it make sense within the organized logic of his life. Even so, he entered that place as someone answering a silent call, without knowing exactly why. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was boredom. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something he still could not name. The shelter was simple, far removed from the luxury Richard knew so well. The walls bore the marks of time. The floor carried the constant smell of cleaning products mixed with kibble and dampness. The sound of barking echoed through the narrow corridors, creating a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to ask for attention, care, a chance. Some dogs became agitated as soon as they saw someone pass, jumping against the bars, wagging their tails, as if begging for one more glance. Others remained quiet, watching with tired eyes, already accustomed to indifference. Richard walked slowly, observing each kennel. There were small, fragile puppies, elderly dogs with graying fur, injured animals, others full of energy. Each carried their own story, even though no one there could fully tell it. He listened to brief explanations from the staff, comments about temperament, length of stay, adoption history. Everything sounded informative, technical, almost bureaucratic. Nothing truly seemed to touch him, until he reached the end of the corridor. There, set apart from the others, was Thor. The kennel was more isolated, surrounded by reinforced bars. There were no colorful signs or optimistic phrases, just a name written simply and a few short, almost cold observations. Thor did not stand up when Richard approached. He did not bark. He did not ask for attention. He remained curled up in a corner, his body tense, muscles rigid, as if always ready to defend himself from an attack that might never come. Or perhaps had come too many times before. Thor was a pit bull rescued from an illegal kennel. His body bore clear signs of suffering. He was too thin for an animal of his build, with ribs slightly visible beneath his short, dull coat. Scars marked his neck, his legs, his muzzle. Some were old, others appeared more recent. Memories etched into the skin of a life marked by violence and neglect. His eyes, however, were what drew the most attention. There was in them a mix of fear, distrust, and something deeper, a silent sadness, almost resigned. Thor had learned far too early that the world was not safe. According to the staff, he had spent most of his life confined, exploited, treated as an object. He did not know genuine affection, did not understand gestures of care. To him, human hands meant pain. Loud voices meant danger. Sudden movements were always followed by punishment. His behavior was not gratuitous aggression, but a defense mechanism built over years of traumatic experiences. He growled at strangers not out of hatred, but out of fear. He shrank into dark corners whenever someone came too close. His eyes followed every movement around him, alert, suspicious. Any unexpected gesture made his body flinch. To most people, Thor did not look like a dog waiting for love. He looked like a risk, a problem about to explode. Richard stood still in front of the bars for a few moments. He observed in silence. Thor slowly lifted his head, eyes fixed on him. There was no challenge in that gaze, only caution. It was as if the animal were trying to understand whether that presence meant another threat, or just someone else who would pass by and forget him shortly after. A shelter employee quickly approached, her tone careful, almost worried. She explained bluntly that Thor had a complicated history. She said he had been returned several times, that no one could handle him, that there was fear, prejudice, poorly told stories. They told Richard he was dangerous, unpredictable, a huge responsibility. They advised him to look at other animals. Any other. Richard listened carefully. As the staff member spoke, he continued to look at Thor. He observed the way the dog avoided direct eye contact, how he kept his body rigid, how he breathed in a restrained manner. It was impossible not to notice that this animal lived in a constant state of alert, like someone who had never truly been able to relax. A being trapped in an invisible battle against memories he could not erase. There was something profoundly unjust about that situation. Thor had not chosen that life. He had not asked to be born into that context, nor to be treated that way. Yet he was the one paying the price. He was the one carrying the label of dangerous, unwanted, irredeemable. To the world, he was just another problematic pit bull. To the shelter, a difficult case. To many, an animal condemned to oblivion. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Suddenly, The scene felt strangely familiar. He recognized that look. He recognized that feeling of being judged for something that did not tell the whole truth. Like Thor, Richard also carried scars, albeit invisible ones. He too had learned to protect himself, to close off, to never fully trust. He too lived surrounded by bars, even if they were made of commitments, expectations, and appearances. While the staff continued explaining why Thor was not a good choice, Richard remained silent. Each argument sounded logical. Each warning made sense. Risk, responsibility, difficulty, danger. Words he knew well. Words used throughout his career to discourage bold decisions. Words he had often ignored. Thor remained motionless, as if already accustomed to hearing those things about himself. As if he knew that the conversation was not for him, but about him. His eyes, however, never left Richard. There was a contained expectation there, almost imperceptible. Not hope, but recognition. Richard realized, in that moment, that Thor did not need someone to save him. He needed someone who would not give up before even trying. To everyone at that shelter, Thor was a problem waiting to happen. A risk no one wanted to take. An animal too difficult, too broken, too frightening. But to Richard, who had spent his entire life dealing with complex challenges and unpopular decisions, that collective rejection sounded less like a warning and more like an invitation. Thor was an animal condemned to be forgotten. And perhaps, for that very reason, he was the most important encounter of Richard's life. The warnings he ignored. The moment Richard expressed, even cautiously, his interest in Thor, the atmosphere around him changed. What until then had been nothing more than a silent visit to a simple shelter turned into a sequence of warnings, apprehensive looks, and explicit attempts to dissuade him. There was no enthusiasm. There was no encouragement. There was only concern, disbelief, and fear. The staff exchanged glances among themselves before reacting. Some seemed relieved that someone had finally noticed Thor. Others showed clear tension. They knew that this decision would not be simple, neither for the animal nor for the man standing before them. The shelter's veterinarian was the first to speak directly. He did not try to soften his words or sugarcoat reality. He chose raw honesty, like someone who had seen too many stories end badly. This breed already carries prejudice, he said firmly. With this specific history, the risk is high. Thor is not an ordinary dog. He requires time, patience, and emotional preparation. One mistake can have serious consequences. Richard listened attentively. He did not interrupt. He did not react immediately. He simply kept his eyes fixed on Thor, who remained motionless in his corner, as if already accustomed to being the center of discussions in which he never took part. The veterinarian continued, explaining that the animal's defensive behavior was not unpredictable by chance. It was the result of years of abuse, conditioning to violence, for survival. Thor did not trust humans because he had learned, in the worst possible way, that trusting meant suffering. Any sudden change, any unexpected stimulus, could trigger instinctive reactions. "We're not saying he's bad," he added. "We're saying he's wounded." Richard nodded slowly. That distinction seemed far too important to ignore. Still, the warnings did not stop there. As soon as word of his interest began to circulate, people close to him were informed. Longtime friends reacted with almost immediate disbelief. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others were genuinely alarmed. "A pit bull," one of them said during a phone call. "In your mansion? Have you lost your mind?" Another was even more direct, almost aggressive. "Do you realize the legal risk? An animal like that, with a history of aggression, imagine if something happens. The press will love it. Your reputation could go down the drain." Richard listened to everyone. As he always had in business, he analyzed each argument, each possible consequence. But this time, something was different. For the first time, he was not making a decision based solely on logic, risk, and return. There was something deeper at stake. When his family found out, the reaction was even more intense. There were long phone calls filled with emotional appeals. People who rarely showed genuine concern were now talking about safety, responsibility, and prudence. They asked him to think about the house staff, the visitors himself. "Think about your safety," pleaded a close relative. "Think about the people who work for you. An animal like that can be unpredictable." The words were heavy with fear. Not only fear of the dog, but fear of breaking a carefully constructed image. Richard had always been the rational, calculating, strategic man. Adopting a rejected pit bull with a history of violence seemed like a dangerous deviation from that pattern. But while everyone spoke, Richard remembered himself. He remembered the times he had been doubted early in his career. The people who said his ideas were too risky, too bold, unrealistic. He remembered how he had been judged, labeled, underestimated. And yet, he had persisted. Against advice, against expectations, against odds. When he looked again at Thor, something inside him aligned. The dog did not react to the warnings, the conversations, the tense expressions around him. He remained there, silent, like someone who no longer expected anything. There was no gratuitous aggression. There was exhaustion. There was fear. There was a story written in scars and silence. Richard felt something difficult to explain. It was not pity. It was not impulse. It was recognition. He saw in Thor a reflection of himself at a level he had never experienced before. A being marked by the past, defined by mistakes and violence he had not chosen, rejected not for what he was, but for what he represented to others. Someone emotionally isolated, living behind invisible barriers, searching for a place where he could simply exist without having to defend himself all the time. Richard realized that, like Thor, he too had learned to protect himself, not to trust, to keep emotional distance, to survive in a world that demanded constant hardness. Both carried marks, some visible, others internal. The warnings continued. Arguments were repeated. Statistics were cited. Stories of attacks, lawsuits, tragedies. Everything seemed reasonable. Everything seemed sensible. But strangely, none of it pushed him away from the decision. For the first time in a long while, Richard did not fear the risk. He feared doing nothing. He feared continuing to live a perfectly safe, perfectly empty life. He feared ignoring that silent call that had begun the moment his eyes met Thor's. He stepped a little closer to the bars. Thor lifted his head, alert. His muscles were still tense, but there was no growl, no sudden retreat, just mutual observation. A brief instant, but heavy with meaning. Richard slowly extended his hand, without touching. He simply stayed there, respecting the animal's space. Thor did not advance. He did not flee either. For the first time, he seemed simply present. It was at that moment that Richard understood. This was not about saving a dog. It was not about challenging prejudice or proving something to the world. It was about offering something he himself had never had, a real chance, without prior judgment, without unrealistic expectations. A safe space to begin again. Against all advice, against all warnings, against all external voices, Richard made his decision. It was not impulsive. It was silent, firm, irrevocable. He took a deep breath, turned to the shelter staff, and said calmly, "I'm taking him." There was silence, looks of shock, final attempts to convince him otherwise. But Richard did not back down. For the first time in many years, he felt he was doing something not because it made sense on paper, but because it made sense inside him. Thor was going home, and in that instant, without either of them knowing it, it was not only the dog's life that was about to change. It was Richard's as well. The first confrontation with reality. The first days were difficult, much more difficult than Richard had imagined, even after all the warnings. The decision to take Thor home had been firm, almost instinctive, but reality did not take long to assert itself forcefully. Within the very first hours, it became clear that this would not be a simple, quick, or comfortable process. The mansion, once silent and impeccable, began to change in visible ways. The spacious environment, organized with almost clinical precision, started to reflect the internal chaos of two beings who did not know how to coexist. Thor did not recognize that place as a home. For him, everything was strange, threatening, unknown. The smells, the sounds, the absence of bars. Everything felt like a mistake that could turn into danger at any moment. As soon as he crossed the door for the first time, Thor froze. His body stiffened, muscles tensed, eyes alert to every detail. He did not explore the house like a curious dog would. He did not wag his tail. He showed no excitement. He simply stood there, breathing shallowly, as if ready to flee or attack if necessary. Richard tried to remain calm. He spoke softly, moved slowly, avoided any sudden gestures. Even so, Thor growled at unexpected sounds. The simple noise of a door closing made the dog shrink. Faster footsteps immediately triggered suspicion. At times, he hid behind furniture, in dark corners, trying to disappear. That first night, Richard barely slept. Thor whimpered, paced back and forth, scratched at doors. The silence that once dominated the house was replaced by constant, tense noises filled with anxiety. When the sun rose, Richard was exhausted, sitting on the living room floor, watching Thor from a distance, not knowing exactly what to do. The following days were no better. The luxury house quickly lost the appearance of perfection that had always impressed visitors. Expensive sofas were scarred by deep scratches. Cushions were torn apart. Decorative objects, chosen with such care, were destroyed during moments of the animal's panic. Stained rugs, scratched doors, chewed furniture. Each damage felt like a physical reminder that this decision had real consequences. But what weighed the most was not the material loss. It was Thor's behavior. He still did not trust. He did not accept closeness. He growled when Richard moved unexpectedly. He kept his distance, watching everything with extreme caution. His eyes followed every step, every gesture, as if constantly assessing risk. There was no gratuitous aggression, but there was permanent tension, a state of alert that never shut off. Richard began to realize how broken that animal was inside. The nights continued to be difficult. Thor slept little, got up at every noise, wandered restlessly through the house. Richard, in turn, began to live according to that state of vigilance. He slept on the couch, woke at any sound, felt his body tired in a way different from the fatigue work used to cause. It was an emotional exhaustion, deep, that left him vulnerable. Veterinary costs began to rise quickly. Frequent consultations, tests, treatments for old injuries, behavioral follow-ups. Each visit revealed more layers of Thor's suffering. The veterinarian explained that trauma would not disappear overnight, that the process would be long, that some wounds might never fully close. Richard listened to everything in silence, signed checks without hesitation. Money was not the problem. It never had been. The real challenge was patience, consistency, the ability to stay when everything seemed to be falling apart. Meanwhile, external criticism intensified. Friends called frequently, now with a tone less concerned and more accusatory. "We warned you. You went too far. This is going to end badly." Some said he was putting his own life at risk. Others claimed it was just a passing eccentricity, a desperate attempt to fill an emotional void. There were those who suggested he was being irresponsible, that he should think with his head, not his heart. Richard listened to everything, and for the first time in a long while, those opinions truly affected him. There were nights when he sat on the kitchen floor, leaning against the wall, exhausted, with the sound of Thor's heavy breathing echoing through the house. In those moments, uncomfortable thoughts surfaced, difficult questions, doubts he could not ignore. What if they're right? What if I'm not capable? What if I've made an irreversible mistake? At times, the idea of returning Thor seemed almost logical. Finding another shelter, looking for a more prepared place, someone with more experience, someone who knew exactly what to do. Richard wondered if he was being selfish by insisting, if he was prolonging Thor's suffering out of pride or stubbornness. But every time that thought appeared, something stopped him. The idea of abandoning Thor was unbearable. He remembered the dog's look at the shelter, that mix of fear and resignation, the way Thor seemed to already expect to be left behind once again. Richard knew, deep down, that returning him would mean confirming everything the world had always shown that animal, that no one stays, that no one endures, that every promise has an expiration date. And there was something more. Richard had made a silent promise, not in words, but in intention. The moment he decided to take Thor home, he had taken on a commitment that went beyond logic. A commitment of presence, of permanence. For the first time in a long while, he did not want to break that promise. Curiously, while dealing with the external chaos, Richard began to notice subtle changes within himself. He, who had always controlled everything, now had to learn to wait, to respect another being's timing, to accept that not everything could be solved with money, planning, or authority. Thor did not respond to commands. He did not bend to logic. He demanded something Richard had neglected for years: empathy. There was one particular night when everything felt especially heavy. Thor had destroyed yet another piece of furniture during a panic episode. Richard was exhausted, emotionally drained. He sat on the floor, head in his hands, feeling a weight in his chest he could not name. Thor, in turn, was leaning against the opposite wall, panting, eyes fixed on him. For a few seconds, the two remained like that, in silence. There was no hostility in that gaze, only exhaustion, a fatigue Richard immediately recognized, because it was the same one he had felt inside himself for years. In that instant, something broke, and something began to rebuild. Richard realized that this confrontation with reality was not just about adapting a traumatized dog to a new home. It was about confronting his own life, his choices, his way of relating to the world. Thor was not just testing his limits. He was exposing his fragilities. And despite all the doubts, despite the sleepless nights, the criticism, and the chaos, Richard knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would not give up, because if he gave up on Thor, he would also be giving up on the only decision he had made, not for status, not for profit, not for appearances, but for truth. And that, for the first time in a long time, mattered more than anything else. The birth of the connection. The transformation did not happen all at once. There was no magical moment, no sudden turning point, no cinematic gesture that changed everything overnight. What began to form between Richard and Thor was born almost imperceptibly, in details so small they could easily go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. It was a slow process, delicate, silent. In the first days after the harshest confrontation with reality, Richard stopped expecting big results. He abandoned the unconscious idea of fixing Thor as if he were just another problem to be managed. Instead, he simply began to observe, to pay attention, to be present without demanding anything in return. Thor remained wary, but something had changed. He no longer hid all the time. At certain moments, he stayed lying in the same room as Richard, still keeping his distance, but without immediately fleeing. It was a shy approach, almost accidental, as if the dog were testing invisible boundaries. Richard began to respect that space. He would sit on the floor, sometimes reading, sometimes simply in silence. He didn't try to touch. He didn't call out. He didn't force interaction. He just stayed there, allowing Thor to get used to his presence. In a world where everything always demanded something from him, that expectation-free attitude was new for both of them. One day, Richard noticed something almost insignificant, yet enough to make his heart race. Thor, who always kept his body rigid, let his tail move slightly when he saw Richard enter the room. It wasn't a celebration or an explosion of joy. It was a discreet, contained movement, almost shy, but it was there. Richard didn't react. He didn't smile excessively or celebrate. He simply kept walking as if nothing had happened. But inside, something warmed. Another day, Thor laid down closer, still without touching. He simply reduced the distance. He stayed there, breathing, alert but less tense. Richard felt his presence like a soft weight in the room. For the first time, the silence of the house didn't feel empty. It felt shared. These small gestures began to repeat. Thor no longer growled as often. His eyes still followed every movement, but with less rigidity. Sometimes he lifted his head when Richard stood up, but he didn't panic. At certain moments, he even seemed to relax, dozing for a few minutes before waking again, as if he still didn't fully trust that rest. Richard began to study Thor with almost scientific attention, yet filled with affection. He observed the times when the dog became more anxious. He noticed which sounds frightened him most. He understood that certain smells made him uneasy. Each reaction was a clue, a fragment of a story Thor couldn't tell in words. In an attempt to help him, Richard did what he had always known how to do. He invested. He bought expensive, soft, imported beds, sophisticated toys designed for mental stimulation, special food, the most expensive on the market, recommended by specialists. Everything was carefully chosen, tested, and placed in the best spots in the house. Nothing seemed to work. Thor ignored the new beds, avoided the toys, sniffed the food suspiciously. Sometimes he ate, sometimes he didn't. Richard began to feel frustrated, not out of anger, but helplessness. For the first time, his money didn't solve the problem. For the first time, there was no immediate solution for sale. That made him reflect. Richard realized he was repeating an old pattern. He was trying to offer Thor the same kind of comfort he had always offered himself. Luxury, excess, expensive things. But, just as with him, none of that filled what was truly missing. One night, after another long day, Richard went to an old cabinet, almost forgotten, at the back of the house. Inside, he kept a few things from his childhood, objects he never had the courage to throw away, though he rarely touched them. Yellowed photographs, an old book, and a worn, old blanket, its fabric faded by time. That blanket had accompanied him through a difficult phase of life. On nights when he felt lonely, insecure, or lost. It was simple, with no material value, but it carried something no luxury item ever had: memory. Without thinking too much, Richard took the blanket to the place where Thor usually lay. He placed it on the floor, stepped back, and sat in silence. Thor watched from a distance. He approached slowly, cautiously. He sniffed the fabric several times. His movements were slow, almost ceremonial. Richard held his breath, afraid any gesture might break that moment. Then, something unexpected happened. Thor lay down on the blanket. Not only did he lie down, he nestled into it. He turned his body, tucked his snout into the fabric, pressed himself against it. For the first time since arriving at the house, he relaxed completely. His muscles loosened. His breathing grew deeper. His eyes closed. Thor had found a safe harbor. Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. He didn't try to hold them back. In that instant, he understood. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about offering the best the market could buy. It was about shelter. That blanket didn't represent status. It represented presence. It represented consistency. It represented something lived, not purchased. Thor hadn't reacted to physical comfort, but to the emotional sensation the object carried. A familiar, human, real scent. Something that said, without words, "You are safe here." From that day on, the connection began to strengthen. Thor started seeking that space more often. And, little by little, he began to approach Richard more. First, lying within eyesight. Then, within reach of touch. One silent night, he lightly leaned his body against Richard's foot. It was minimal contact, almost accidental, but enough for both of them to feel its impact. Richard didn't move. He stayed there, respecting that fragile gesture, understanding that trust is not demanded, it is built. Every second that passed was an invisible brick in that slow construction. With time, Thor began to accept brief affection. A quick touch on the head, a gentle stroke along his back, always cautiously, always alert. But there were no more growls. There was curiosity. There was acceptance. Richard realized that while he was caring for Thor, something inside him was being cared for as well. He began to slow down, to observe more, to listen more, to be present in a way he had never been, not even with himself. The silence of the house stopped being oppressive. It became a space of mutual healing. Two beings marked by difficult pasts, learning together that safety doesn't come from control, but from permanence. The connection wasn't born from a great heroic gesture. It was born from small moments, from patience, from respect, from shelter. And in that old blanket, worn by time, Richard and Thor found something both had lost long ago: the feeling of belonging. Richard's transformation. The change in Richard didn't happen abruptly. Just like his connection with Thor, it formed slowly, almost in silence, like something growing from the inside out. There was no exact moment when he realized he was different. The transformation revealed itself in habits, in small choices, in the way he began to occupy his time and the space around him. Little by little, Thor began to follow him around the house. At first, it was just a distant presence. The dog would walk a few steps behind him and stop, watching. Then he began to follow him from one room to another. There was no anxiety or possessiveness, just a calm need to be nearby. Thor lay at his feet while Richard worked, his body relaxed but attentive. The animal's deep breathing filled the room with a sense of calm Richard had never experienced before. During meals, Thor stayed close, without begging, without restlessness. He waited patiently, as if he understood that this moment was also part of their shared routine. These small gestures, almost banal to an outside observer, carried enormous weight for Richard. They were worth more than any multi-million-dollar contract, more than any public recognition. They were silent proof that trust was being built. Richard began to notice that his house, once cold and silent, now had life. Not the noisy life of social events, but a constant, true presence. The simple sound of Thor's paws on the floor, the weight of the dog's body as he lay down, the rhythmic breathing during sleep. Everything took on deep meaning. And then, something unexpected happened. Richard began waking up earlier. For years, his alarm clock rang for meetings, trips, unavoidable commitments. Now, he woke up even before the alarm, driven by a completely different reason. It wasn't anxiety. It was readiness. He got up, put on simple clothes, and picked up Thor's leash. Morning walks became a ritual. At first, Richard walked with a busy mind, thinking about tasks, pending issues, decisions. But little by little, something changed. Thor's pace was different from his. The dog stopped to sniff the ground, observe distant movement, listen to sounds Richard had never noticed. Forced to slow down, Richard began to look around. For the first time in a long time, he truly observed the world. Trees changing color with the seasons. The sky in tones he had never noticed, even after traveling the entire world. Ordinary people going to work, talking, laughing, living. Simple situations, devoid of status, yet full of humanity. These walks awakened something forgotten inside him. Richard realized he had spent years living on autopilot, always projected toward the next goal, the next achievement. Thor, with his calm presence, pulled him back to the now, to the present moment, to what was right in front of his eyes. Over time, Richard began reorganizing his routine. Meetings that once seemed urgent were postponed. Social commitments lost importance. He began to say no more easily, something he had never done before. For the first time, he felt that his time didn't need to be constantly filled to have value. Meanwhile, Thor continued to change. The dog no longer startled at every noise. He accepted longer affection. He wagged his tail more freely. At times, he approached spontaneously, pressing his snout into Richard's hand as if asking for contact. Each step forward, no matter how small, was celebrated in silence. Watching Thor, Richard began to see patterns. The aggression that once frightened everyone wasn't hatred. It was fear, a defense mechanism built over years of pain. Distrust wasn't rebellion. It was trauma, the result of broken promises, hurting hands, unsafe environments. And love. Love wasn't absent. It was something that needed time. This realization resonated deeply within Richard. He began to reflect on his own life with uncomfortable clarity. How many times had he himself closed off out of fear? How many relationships had been sabotaged not by lack of feeling, but by lack of patience? How many opportunities for connection had he rejected because he didn't want to expose himself? Thor wasn't just a difficult dog. He was a mirror, a reflection of everything Richard had become over the years. Someone functional, successful, but emotionally armored. Someone who responded to the world with control and distance, because, at some point, he had learned that feeling too much was dangerous. Caring for Thor demanded something Richard had never needed to offer in business: vulnerability. He had to be aware of his own gestures, his tone of voice, the energy he transmitted. He had to recognize when he was tense, impatient, absent. Thor reacted to that immediately. If Richard arrived carrying stress, the dog grew uneasy. If he was calm, Thor relaxed. This silent exchange taught Richard something fundamental. Emotions are contagious. Presence matters. Inner state matters. Over time, Richard began taking better care of himself. He slept more, ate more mindfully, spent less time in front of screens. Read for pleasure, not obligation. Simple things that once seemed like a waste of time became essential. He began to feel something he had never bought: peace. In moments of quiet, sitting on the floor with Thor lying beside him, Richard allowed himself to feel. He felt sadness for everything he had lost, gratitude for what he was living, hope, something that had disappeared without him noticing. Thor, in turn, seemed to feel it. The dog approached more often, rested his head on Richard's lap, slept deeply beside him without startle. It was living proof that trust, when cultivated with patience, flourishes. Richard understood that the relationship wasn't about taming a problematic animal. It was about learning to love without haste, without demands, without unrealistic expectations, without conditions. Thor taught Richard that deep wounds don't heal with grand promises, but with constant presence. That true transformation doesn't happen in haste, but in permanence. And in that silent process, while helping Thor learn to trust again, Richard realized something even more powerful. He was also relearning how to trust in himself, in time, in the possibility of a simpler and truer life. Richard's transformation wasn't featured on magazine covers. It didn't generate headlines. It didn't earn applause. But it was, without a doubt, the greatest achievement of his life. The decisive moment. That night began like so many others. The house was quiet, wrapped in a tranquility Richard had learned to appreciate. Thor slept stretched out on the rug beside the sofa, his body relaxed, breathing deep and steady. Richard read casually, unhurried, something unthinkable months earlier. There were no pending meetings, urgent calls, or strategic decisions to make. Just a simple, shared moment. Then, something went out of control. At a distant point in the house, a silent short circuit began to form. An old wire, overloaded, heated beyond its limit. There was no explosion, no immediate noise, just an almost imperceptible snap, followed by a faint smell of burned plastic mixing with the night air. Richard didn't notice. Thor did. The dog lifted his head abruptly. His ears moved, his body sprang from rest in seconds. He sniffed the air, restless, walked a few steps, then returned, now clearly alert. His eyes were different, focused, urgent. Thor began to bark. It wasn't an aggressive bark. It was a warning, an insistent, desperate sound that cut through the silence of the house. Richard startled, his heart instantly racing. For months, Thor had almost never barked like that. This wasn't normal. This wasn't random. "Thor!" Richard called, standing up quickly. The dog ran a few meters down the hallway and returned, barking louder, as if asking him to follow. Richard felt a chill run through his body. Something was wrong. Even before understanding what it was, he decided to trust. He followed Thor. That's when the smell grew stronger. A light smoke began to spread near the service area. The lights flickered for a second. Richard's stomach turned. In seconds, the situation stopped being just a scare. The fire started small, but treacherous. A discreet flame, fed by wires and flammable materials, grew quickly. The alarm system hadn't yet gone off. If it weren't for Thor, no one might have noticed in time. Thor barked again, louder, running back and forth. Richard reacted instinctively. He shouted for the staff, manually activated the alarms, ran for the extinguishers. The house that had long symbolized absolute control was now filled with smoke, tension, and urgency. While the staff moved around, confused, Thor stayed by Richard's side. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't panic. Even with the strong smell and growing smoke, the dog stayed there, attentive to Richard's every move, as if his mission were clear, not to leave him alone. At several moments, Thor positioned himself between Richard and the flames, growling at the fire as if it were a visible enemy. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. The animal so many had called dangerous was now showing silent, instinctive, absolute courage. There was no calculation, no fear, only loyalty. The situation worsened quickly. The smoke made it hard to see. The heat increased. Richard coughed, his eyes burned. In the midst of the chaos, one of the staff tried to pull Thor outside, shouting for the dog to leave. Thor resisted. He pulled back, refusing to abandon Richard. "Leave him," Richard shouted hoarsely. "He stays with me." That sentence, spoken in the heat of the moment, carried immense symbolic weight. For the first time, Richard wasn't protecting Thor just out of promise or compassion. He was acknowledging the bond. He was declaring out loud that they belonged to each other. Together, they managed to control the fire before it became a tragedy. The fire was contained. There was material damage, but no one was hurt. When everything finally calmed down, silence returned. Heavy, broken only by the distant sound of alarms and everyone's exhausted breathing. Richard sat on the floor, exhausted, his heart still racing. Thor approached slowly and lay beside him, pressing his body against his. There was no more tension, just presence, just closeness. Richard ran his hand over Thor's body, feeling the warmth, the life, the solidity of that being so many had rejected. That night, Richard didn't see a dangerous animal. He saw loyalty. He saw courage. He saw family. As he stroked Thor, images passed through his mind. The criticism, the warnings, the harsh words. "This will end badly. That dog is a risk. You're crazy." All of it now felt distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered was there, breathing beside him. Thor had saved his life. But more than that, he had confirmed something Richard already felt but hadn't yet dared to fully admit. This relationship was no longer about rescuing a traumatized animal. It was about mutual belonging, shared care, a bond built day after day, through patience, respect, and permanence. Later, when everyone had left and the house had returned to a minimally controlled state, Richard remained awake. Sitting on the floor with Thor lying beside him, he reflected on everything that had happened since that casual visit to the shelter. He thought about who he used to be. He thought about the man who lived surrounded by luxury, yet isolated. He thought about the emptiness that accompanied him on silent nights. And he thought about who he was now, a man who had faced fear, who had chosen to stay when it would have been easier to give up, who had learned that trust cannot be bought, who had discovered that true love is not announced. It is proven. Thor lifted his head and looked at him. His eyes no longer carried distrust. There was something new there, something solid, something that didn't need words. Richard smiled, feeling an emotion he couldn't remember having felt so clearly before. That night, while the smell of smoke still lingered in the air and the house bore marks of the scare, Richard knew with absolute certainty that none of it had been in vain. The fire could have destroyed everything, but instead it revealed what truly mattered. Thor was not a problem, not a risk, not a mistake. He was living proof that when someone chooses to stay, truly stay, even the deepest traumas can be transformed. And there, sitting on the floor, man and dog, Richard understood that family is not defined by blood, status, or appearance. Family is who chooses to stay when everything threatens to fall apart. The world's reaction. The story didn't take long to go beyond the walls of the mansion. At first, it spread almost casually. A comment ir? A photo there. A report made by an employee, told in a tone of astonishment to a friend, who told another. Within a few hours, the episode of the fire and the pit bull who refused to abandon his owner began circulating in small circles. And then, like everything in the digital age, it reached unimaginable proportions. The first reactions were not kind. An irresponsible millionaire, some said. This is romanticizing a risk, others claimed. Money doesn't buy common sense, they repeated. Opinion columnists wrote harsh pieces. Aggressive comments flooded social media. For many, Richard was just another rich man playing at saving the world, putting lives at risk because of an emotional choice. The focus, however, was not Thor. It was the prejudice that existed even before the story began. The label came quickly. Pit bull. Dangerous. Unpredictable. Few bothered to understand the context. Thor's past. The adaptation process. The bond built with patience. For critics, the breed alone was enough to define the outcome they believed was still to come. Richard watched it all in silence. For years, he had been used to criticism about business, financial decisions, corporate strategies. But this was different. Now, it wasn't his reputation at stake. It was the dignity of someone who couldn't defend himself with words. Thor. That's when something changed. A short video began circulating. Recorded by one of the employees days after the fire, it showed Thor calmly walking beside Richard in the garden. No leash pulling, no tension, just synchronized steps. At one point, Richard sat on a bench, and Thor lay at his feet, resting his head on Richard's shoe. Nothing spectacular, nothing staged, nothing forced, but there was something impossible to ignore: trust. The video went viral. Soon after, another appeared. Thor receiving affection from a visiting child, under Richard's attentive yet calm gaze. Then images of the dog sleeping deeply during an informal meeting, indifferent to the movement around him. The narrative began to crack. People started questioning the ready-made discourse they had always heard. Comments changed tone. Where there had been accusations, doubts began to appear. Where there had been absolute certainty, curiosity was born. He doesn't seem aggressive. That's not the behavior they say pit bulls have. Maybe the problem was never the breed. Experts joined the conversation. Animal behaviorists analyzed the videos. Renowned veterinarians gave interviews. Psychologists specializing in trauma explained clearly what many refused to see: aggression doesn't come from nowhere. It is built by fear, pain, and neglect. Thor began to be cited as an example, not of an exception, but of potential. A traumatized dog who, when given stability, respect, and time, responded with balance. Not by miracle, but by consequence. Some of the same experts who had publicly warned Richard before went back on their statements. In honest interviews, they acknowledged that prejudice against certain breeds had shaped generic recommendations, often unfair. Public opinion began to shift. Television programs requested interviews. Newspapers wanted to tell the real story. Portals that had once been critical now used words like redemption, overcoming, and unlikely bond. Richard, who had always avoided personal exposure, decided to speak. Not to defend himself, but to defend Thor and so many others like him. In his first interview, he was direct. Thor didn't just save me from a fire. He saved me from a limited view of love, control, and fear. The problem was never the breed. The problem was always abandonment. The words resonated.